On March 12, 1981, at approximately 8:47 p.m., a man entered the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., carrying a briefcase that would lead to the dissolution of his family. This man was Richard Coleman, aged 44. The briefcase contained photographs of classified documents, coded Russian letters, and a list of names penned in his wife's handwriting. 3 hours after his arrival, when he departed the building, his wife would be under federal investigation for espionage, and their 3 children would become central figures in one of the most intricate cover stories of the Cold War era. The Colemans resided in Arlington, Virginia, a mere 20-minute commute from downtown Washington. Their home was a 2-story colonial in a neighborhood where neighbors were acquainted and children played outdoors until the streetlights illuminated. Richard held a position as a mid-level analyst at the Department of Commerce, a role he'd occupied since 1973. Margaret also worked at Commerce 3 days a week as an administrative assistant in the Office of Trade Policy. She had reduced her hours from full-time after the birth of their first child in 1968. On her non-work days, Tuesdays and Thursdays, she provided piano lessons from their home, scheduling students throughout the afternoon while their children, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah, were at school. Long after the fact, neighbors described them as an ordinary family navigating the routines of suburban life in the nascent Reagan administration. They were a dual-income household managing their lives through meticulous coordination of schedules and responsibilities. However, on January 28, 1981, this facade began to crumble. Richard returned home from work early that day, around 2:30 p.m., citing what he later described as flu-like symptoms. Margaret, who had been upstairs, descended quickly upon hearing his car in the driveway. Too quickly, according to Richard's subsequent testimony, her face flushed and exhibiting an unusual nervousness. He didn't dwell on it at the time, going to lie down in the guest room. He likely would have dismissed the incident entirely had he not discovered something the following morning. In their bedroom closet, against the back wall, there was a floorboard that never quite aligned with the others. Richard had intended to fix it for months. On the morning of January 29th, he noticed the floorboard protruded more than usual. Prying it up, he found a metal box, roughly 8 inches by 6 inches. Within this box lay evidence that his wife was collaborating with the Soviets. The contents of the box were systematically documented in Richard's later statements to federal investigators. There were 23 photographs of what appeared to be official documents, taken in subdued lighting with a 35mm camera. Some he recognized from his own work, including various trade analysis reports and policy assessments. Others seemed to originate from different offices within Commerce documents Margaret would have accessed through her administrative capacity, such as memoranda and briefing papers that passed her desk for filing or distribution. There were 4 letters inscribed in coded Russian, subsequently translated and found to contain instructions regarding dead drops and communication protocols. Receipts from a Georgetown photo development shop, dated between May 1980 and January 1981, were also present. Finally, a notebook, approximately 3.5 inches, was filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations that cryptographers would later identify as a basic substitution code. Richard did not confront his wife. Instead, he dedicated the next 6 weeks to what amounted to a personal surveillance operation. The methodical nature of his investigation, meticulously detailed in his formal statement to federal agents, revealed a man convinced he needed irrefutable evidence before taking the devastating step of reporting his own wife to authorities. Richard's initial action was to photograph every item in the metal box. He utilized his personal 35mm camera, a Canon AE-1 typically used for family snapshots. He shot 2 rolls of film, ensuring every page, every notation, and every potentially relevant detail was captured. He took the film to a different photo development shop than Margaret's frequented one, choosing a location in Silver Spring where he paid in cash and provided an alias. Upon retrieving the prints 3 days later, he stored them in a locked drawer in his office at the Commerce Department, inaccessible to Margaret. He then began regularly inspecting the box, establishing a pattern that allowed him to monitor changes without alerting Margaret to his discovery. According to his subsequent testimony, he checked the box on February 3rd, 7th, 11th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and March 2nd. Each time, He noted any alterations, new items appearing, or old ones being removed. On February 7th, 3 new photographs emerged. Documents resembling internal Commerce Department memos concerning grain export policies to Eastern Europe. One was a report Richard himself had worked on, a document he had brought home to review over the weekend 2 weeks prior. The realization that Margaret had been photographing materials from his own briefcase, materials he had left on his home office desk, caused him physical distress. On February 19th, the notebook contained 2 new pages of coded entries. By March 2nd, one of the original letters was missing, replaced by a new one with different handwriting. The documentation was precise. Richard maintained a log in a small notebook kept in his car, recording dates, times, and observations. He noted when Margaret left the house and when she returned, and he observed patterns in her behavior, minor clues he had previously overlooked but now seemed glaringly obvious. She consistently checked the mailbox before he arrived home from work, lingering by the street for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something. She made frequent phone calls from the kitchen phone, brief conversations that abruptly ceased if he entered the room. She had developed a habit of running errands on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, her non-work days, always between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m., always claiming she was going to the grocery store, pharmacy, or visiting her friend Patricia. However, when Richard began to follow her, he discovered that these errands rarely led to the destinations she claimed. On Tuesday, February 2nd, Margaret departed the house at 7:23 p.m. Richard waited 3 minutes, then followed in his car, maintaining a sufficient distance to avoid her noticing his headlights. She drove not to the grocery store, but to PTOAC Park, a location approximately 4 miles from their home. She parked near the entrance, walked to a specific bench overlooking the water, and sat there for precisely 20 minutes. She did not appear to meet anyone. She simply sat, sometimes reading a book, sometimes just gazing at the water. At 8:02 p.m., she rose, returned to her car, and drove to a 7-Eleven where she purchased milk and bread, establishing what Richard would later recognize as an alibi for her absence. He documented the same pattern multiple times throughout February. Always a Tuesday or Thursday evening, always the same park, always the same bench, always for exactly 20 minutes. Richard began arriving at the park before Margaret, positioning himself to observe without being seen. He watched her intently, searching for signs of contact with another person, but he never witnessed her speaking to anyone or exchanging anything. What he did notice, however, was that she consistently sat on the same bench, a green painted bench adorned with a dedication plaque, and she always placed her purse on the left side of the bench, never on her lap, never on the right side. On February 26th, Richard arrived at the park 2 hours before Margaret's usual time and positioned himself approximately 50 yards away with a pair of binoculars he had borrowed from a colleague at work, claiming an interest in bird watching. At 7:04 p.m., a man approached the bench where Margaret would later sit. He was approximately 45 years old, wearing a dark coat and a hat, and he sat on the bench for less than 3 minutes. During that time, he appeared to read a newspaper. He then folded the newspaper, placed it on the bench, and departed. The newspaper remained on the bench for approximately 10 minutes before another individual, a jogger who appeared to be exercising, briefly sat down, picked up the newspaper, and continued his run. When Margaret arrived at 7:27 p.m., the bench was empty. She sat down, placed her purse on the left side as always, and remained there for 20 minutes. Upon her departure, the purse appeared slightly less full than when she had arrived, though Richard could not be certain from his vantage point. What he could be certain of was that he had just witnessed what appeared to be a classic dead drop operation, the type of intelligence exchange he had been briefed about during his security clearances at the Commerce Department. Richard's investigation extended beyond surveillance. He began to pay attention to Margaret's daily routines at home, searching for other signs of deception he might have missed. He observed that she often stayed up later than him, claiming she wished to finish a book or prepare lessons for the next day's students. On the night of March 3rd, Richard feigned sleep on the couch while watching television, and through half-closed eyes, he observed Margaret come downstairs at 11:47 p.m. She checked to ensure he was sleeping, then went to the kitchen. He heard the sound of the basement door opening and closing. After she returned upstairs, he waited 15 minutes, then descended to the basement himself. The basement was unfinished, primarily used for storage and housing the washer and dryer. Richard conducted a systematic search, displacing boxes, checking behind the water heater, seeking anything that appeared out of place. Tucked away behind an accumulation of old paint cans in the furthest corner, he unearthed a small canvas pouch, the kind often used for athletic attire. Inside, as he examined them by flashlight, were items that caused his hands to tremble. A second set of identification credentials bearing Margaret's photograph, but under a different name, Elaine Warner, with an address in Baltimore. A road map of the greater Washington area, several locations highlighted in pencil. $500 in cash, composed of 20s and 10s, and a compact pocket calendar with dates marked, dates that corresponded precisely with the Tuesday and Thursday evenings Margaret had been absent from the house. Richard meticulously photographed everything, replaced the items in the bag exactly as he had found them, and ascended back upstairs. He did not achieve sleep that night. Instead, he remained in the darkened living room, contemplating the woman he had been married to for 16 years, questioning the authenticity of their shared life and the extent to which it had been a meticulously constructed facade. He recalled their initial meeting in 1965, both nascent employees at Commerce, and how he had been captivated by her intellect and her passion for music. He now pondered if she had deliberately targeted him, if their entire relationship had been orchestrated by her handlers, or if her recruitment had occurred later, and she had simply exploited their existing marriage. His thoughts drifted to their wedding, the births of their children, and mundane moments such as grocery shopping, watching television, and disputing whose turn it was to dispose of the trash. He remembered all the instances he had left his briefcase in his home office, never suspecting that his wife was sifting through its contents after he had fallen asleep. He contemplated whether any of it had held the same significance for Margaret as it had for him, or if he had merely served as a convenient prop in her clandestine life, a man with the requisite security clearances and an unfortunate excess of trust. By March 10th, Richard had amassed what he believed to be sufficient evidence to present to federal authorities. He possessed photographs of the contents of the metal box. He had his surveillance log meticulously detailing Margaret's movements. He had photographs of the items found in the basement. He had dates, times, and specific locations. What he lacked, and what perpetually disturbed his sleep, was any notion of how to shield Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah from the catastrophic ramifications of his impending actions. He spent hours during his lunch breaks in his car, parked in anonymous lots around Washington, wrestling with the impossible ethical dilemma he faced. If he reported Margaret, she would face arrest and espionage charges. The arrest would be public. The trial would be public. And his children would become known throughout their schools and community as the offspring of a Soviet spy. They would endure questioning, investigation, and potentially even suspicion of complicity in their mother's activities. They would grow up under that indelible shadow, branded by a crime they had no involvement in, judged for associations they had never chosen. However, if he chose not to report Margaret, he would become an accomplice in her espionage. He would, in essence, become an accessory to her crimes. And the intelligence she was transmitting to the Soviets, regardless of the detriment it inflicted upon American interests, would persist because he had prioritized his family's reputation over his allegiance to his nation. The ultimate decision he reached was to pursue both courses of action, to report Margaret to the FBI and to fashion an elaborate deception that would safeguard his children from the truth. He would surrender his wife, but he would not permit his children to comprehend the genuine reason for her removal from their lives. The plan began to solidify in his mind during the first week of March, progressively refined through sleepless nights and agonizing contemplation of every conceivable outcome. He researched cancer treatment protocols at the library, acquiring enough medical terminology to render the fabrication believable. He identified a fictitious treatment facility, asserting its location in upstate New York, a sufficient distance to render visits impractical, yet not so remote as to appear implausible. He prepared responses to the questions he anticipated Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah would pose regarding prognosis, side effects, and the duration of their mother's absence. On March 11th, Richard resolved to approach the FBI the following evening. He spent that day at work in a blur, struggling to concentrate on his assigned duties, acutely aware that he was on the precipice of setting in motion events that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his family's existence. He returned home that evening and shared dinner with Margaret and the children. It was a typical Wednesday night dinner: spaghetti, garlic bread, and salad. Jennifer recounted a test she had taken at school. Michael expressed excitement about a science project involving potato batteries. Sarah inquired if she could have a sleepover with her friend Amanda on Friday night. Margaret chuckled at something Michael said, leaned over to wipe a stain from Sarah's chin, looked at Richard, and asked if he was feeling well, as he seemed subdued. Richard assured her he was fine, merely fatigued from work. He sat at that dinner table, knowing it was the last ordinary meal they would ever share as a family, knowing that within 24 hours everything would be fundamentally different. He knew his children would spend years, possibly decades, attempting to comprehend his impending actions. Yet, he had made his selection. And on March 12, 1981, he entered the J. Edgar Hoover building and commenced the process of dismantling his life in order to preserve it. What Richard struggled with during those 6 weeks, according to his subsequent interviews with federal investigators, was not whether to disclose his findings, but rather how to do so without devastating his children. Jennifer was 13, Michael was 11, and Sarah was 8. They had no inkling their mother was leading a dual life. Richard became increasingly fixated on the dilemma of how to inform 3 elementary and middle school students that their parent was a Soviet spy without inflicting permanent trauma. The solution he devised, which he would present to the FBI on March 12th, was to tell them their mother had cancer. Special Agent David Thornton, the lead investigator who took Richard's initial statement, later recounted the meeting in a declassified debriefing memo. Richard arrived at 8:47 p.m., waited 47 minutes before approaching the front desk, and then dedicated the subsequent 3 hours to detailing everything he had uncovered. Thornton's notes indicate that Richard was composed, methodical, and unwavering on 2 crucial points. First, that his wife required immediate arrest, and second, that his children must remain unaware of the true reason. The FBI had, in fact, been investigating a suspected leak from the Commerce Department since late 1980. Documents concerning international trade policy and strategic resource assessments had been appearing in Soviet intelligence reports, indicating that someone with access was supplying information to Moscow. They had not yet identified the source. Richard's evidence provided them with all the necessary components: a name, a methodology, and a timeline extending back to at least 1977, based on the earliest dates within the recovered materials. What rendered the case particularly damaging, Thornton observed in his report, was Margaret's access to documents via 2 distinct channels: her own administrative position, which granted her legitimate access to a broad spectrum of interoffice communications and policy papers, and her husband's work materials, which he occasionally brought home and left unsecured in his home office. She had exploited both her professional role and her marital relationship to maximize the intelligence she could furnish to her handlers. However, Richard's request concerning his children presented what Thornton later termed an unusual ethical and operational quandary. The Bureau would typically have no involvement in how a suspect's family was informed about an arrest, but Richard was seeking active cooperation in maintaining a false narrative. He wished to inform his children that their mother had been diagnosed with cancer, that she needed to depart for treatment, and that she might not survive. He desired the FBI to facilitate a farewell visit framed as a hospital visit. He requested Margaret's arrest be conducted discreetly, without media presence or public filing of charges, until the narrative of her illness was firmly established with the children. The request ascended the chain of command. According to declassified memos, there was considerable debate within the FBI regarding the appropriateness or even legality of collaborating with such a deception. Ultimately, however, the decision was made to accede to Richard's request, partly out of empathy for the children, and partly because a clandestine arrest served the Bureau's interests by avoiding the alarming of other potential Soviet assets who might be linked to Margaret's network. Margaret Coleman was arrested at 6:47 a.m. on March 14, 1981, a Saturday morning. Federal agents executed an arrest warrant based on a sealed criminal complaint filed the preceding evening. 2 agents gained entry to the house through the front door, which Richard had left unlocked, and took her into custody in the kitchen as she was preparing coffee. According to the arrest report, she offered no resistance, did not request legal counsel, but simply gazed at Richard and uttered, "You found it." The children remained asleep upstairs. Richard gathered Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah in the living room that afternoon and informed them of their mother's illness. He used the word cancer, stated its severity, and explained her need to travel to a specialized treatment facility in another state. According to Jennifer's later recollections, her father was exceptionally precise about certain specifics. The type of cancer, the treatment protocol, and the reasons why immediate visits would be impossible. He showed them medical pamphlets he had acquired from the library. He explained that their mother wished to shield them from witnessing her challenging medical treatments. The children accepted his explanation, as their father was not prone to dramatic pronouncements or emotional manipulation. If he stated their mother was unwell, then she was unwell. 2 days later, on March 16th, Margaret was granted a supervised visit with her children at a secure federal facility in Northern Virginia. The children were informed they were going to visit their mother at the hospital. They entered a room furnished with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting, where Margaret was already present. According to the supervising agent's report, she embraced each child for an extended period, instructing them to be strong, to assist their father, and to remember her love for them. The visit lasted 30 minutes. It was the final time Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah would see their mother for 14 years. Margaret Coleman's guilty plea proceedings commenced on August 3, 1981, in federal court. Due to the classified nature of the evidence, the proceedings were conducted under the Classified Information Procedures Act, with portions sealed and public access restricted. She pleaded guilty to 3 charges: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of national defense information, and acting as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General. The prosecution's case, detailed in court documents, established that Margaret had been recruited in 1974 by a woman named Elena Rostova, who posed as a fellow piano teacher but was, in fact, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. The recruitment process was gradual. Initial requests involved basic information, publicly available documents, and assessments of Commerce Department personnel, which seemed like innocent gossip. By 1977, according to Margaret's own testimony, she was photographing classified documents 2 or 3 times a month, leveraging her administrative access to copy materials that crossed her desk and supplementing these with documents from Richard's briefcase when he brought work home. She would wait until late at night after Richard had fallen asleep, then photograph any available materials using a small camera provided by Elena. She stated she was never paid in cash, but her children's piano lessons were subsidized. Her husband's car was mysteriously repaired after a breakdown. These were minor benefits that appeared coincidental but were, in fact, calculated compensation. When the judge inquired why she had acted in this manner, Margaret's response, preserved in court transcripts, was concise. She stated that she had initially believed she was contributing to peace and mutual understanding between nations. She elaborated that by the time she realized she was being used for espionage rather than diplomacy, she had been explicitly warned that refusing to continue would result in harm to her family. She claimed she had been afraid, and that fear had kept her complicit for years. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. She was transferred to a federal women's correctional facility within a week. Back in Arlington, Richard Coleman was implementing the second phase of his strategy: to maintain the pretense that Margaret was alive and undergoing indefinite treatment. He informed neighbors that she was in a long-term care facility that prohibited visitors due to her compromised immune system. He told the children's teachers that their mother was receiving experimental treatment and that they should be patient with any behavioral changes in the children. He kept Margaret's piano in the living room. He displayed framed photographs of her throughout the house. He spoke about her in the present tense, as if she might return at any moment once the treatments were successful. The children adapted as children do, imperfectly, but with the resilience born of having no alternative. Jennifer immersed herself in her studies, becoming student council president and achieving straight A's throughout high school. Michael developed a fascination with disassembling and reassembling objects: radios, bicycles, and eventually computers. Sarah, the youngest, became quieter, more withdrawn, the type of child teachers describe as appearing older than her years. Richard wrote to Margaret occasionally, sending brief updates about the children's progress that were carefully devoid of any personal emotion. Margaret replied with monthly letters that arrived in plain envelopes with an institutional postmark, which Richard locked in a drawer in his study. He convinced himself he was saving them for when the children were older, when they could comprehend. But months turned into years, and he never found the opportune moment to explain that the story about their mother's illness had been a complete fabrication. The deception might have persisted indefinitely had Jennifer Coleman, by then a freshman at the University of Virginia, not started to notice inconsistencies in 1987. Her mother had supposedly been diagnosed in early 1981. It was now 1987. 6 years was an exceptionally long time to be undergoing cancer treatment without either recovering or dying. Jennifer had majored in biology partly because she wished to understand her mother's illness. What she was learning from her coursework was that the timeline her father had provided did not make medical sense. She called Richard from her dorm room on April 22, 1987, according to phone records later reviewed during a family therapy session, and directly asked him when their mother had actually died. This was, to her, the only logical explanation: that Margaret had died years ago, and Richard had been unable to inform them. Richard later recounted that hearing his daughter ask that question, and witnessing the logic she had used to arrive at it, made him realize that the lie had reached its natural conclusion. He told her the truth over the phone. He informed her about the arrest, the espionage charges, and the 25-year federal sentence. He told her that her mother was alive and imprisoned in Georgia and had been there for 6 years. Jennifer's reaction, according to Richard's later account, was silence. Several minutes of complete silence. Then she said, "I need to think about this," and hung up. She called Michael 3 days later. Michael was 17, a high school senior, and according to his own later description, his response to learning that his entire childhood had been based on a falsehood was cold fury. He demanded specifics, dates, and documentation. He wanted to know precisely what his mother had done, exactly why his father had lied, and precisely how many other individuals had been complicit in maintaining the deception. He confronted Richard in person, and their argument, according to neighbors, was audible through the walls. Sarah was 14 when Jennifer and Michael sat her down and disclosed the truth. Her reaction was to cry quietly for approximately 2 hours, and then to cease speaking to Richard beyond what was absolutely necessary for basic household communication. What transpired next was described by family therapist Dr. Patricia Morrison, who began working with the Colemans in 1988, as a textbook case of trust dissolution. Jennifer returned home from college only for mandatory holidays and maintained emotional distance from Richard during those visits. Michael stopped speaking to his father entirely for 11 months, communicating only through written notes about logistical matters. Sarah developed what Morrison identified as complex grief symptoms, mourning not just the mother she had lost, but the father she felt she had never truly known. The central question all 3 children posed in various forms was why Richard had chosen to lie. Why had he assumed they could not handle the truth? Why had he denied them the opportunity to know their mother as she actually was, to make their own decisions about how to process what she had done? Why had he stripped them of that agency for 6 years? Richard's answers, documented in therapy sessions, centered on protection. He had wanted to shield them from stigma, from the social repercussions of being known as the children of a Soviet spy. He had wished to preserve their memory of their mother as someone who loved them, rather than as someone who had betrayed their country. He had genuinely believed that the truth would wound them more than the lie. However, what became clear through those therapy sessions was that the lie itself had inflicted extensive damage. The children had not merely lost their mother, they had lost their ability to trust their father's account of reality. They had spent their formative years grieving a false narrative while the truth was withheld from them, and that betrayal of trust proved more challenging to overcome than Margaret's original act of espionage might have been. In June 1995, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah drove to a federal correctional facility and visited their mother in prison for the first time. Margaret was 62 years old, 14 years into her sentence. According to the prison visitation log, the meeting lasted 4 hours, the maximum allowed for family visits. What was discussed during those 4 hours comes primarily from the children's later accounts, as prison visits are not recorded unless specifically authorized for investigative purposes. Margaret explained as best she could how she had been recruited. She described Elena Rostova, the woman who had befriended her at a piano teachers' conference in 1974, who had gradually and skillfully manipulated her into increasingly compromising situations until she was too entrapped to extricate herself. She stated she had attempted to stop multiple times but had been explicitly told that her family would be harmed if she ceased cooperation. The 3 Coleman children began visiting regularly after that initial meeting. Michael traveled from North Carolina, having relocated there for an engineering position. Jennifer arrived from Washington, D.C., where she had commenced a career in public policy. Sarah visited during breaks from her graduate studies in clinical psychology in Virginia. They fostered a semblance of a connection with their mother. However, this relationship was constrained to 30-minute intervals within a prison visiting room, bearing little resemblance to the bond they might have shared under altered circumstances. Richard Coleman never visited Margaret in prison. She occasionally wrote him concise letters, expressing gratitude for his upbringing of their children and acknowledging the impossible predicament he faced. He retained these letters but offered no reply. As he later stated, he believed he had fulfilled his obligation to safeguard his children. While he could intellectually concede that the deception had caused its own damage, he found himself unable to regret the decision he made in 1981. Margaret Coleman was released from federal prison on November 8, 2006, after serving 22 years of her sentence, which had been reduced for good behavior and her cooperation with counterintelligence debriefings. She moved into a small apartment in Atlanta, secured employment as a clerk in a music store, and initiated the challenging endeavor of constructing a life as a 63-year-old woman who had last experienced freedom in 1981. Richard Coleman passed away on June 15, 2010, at the age of 73, due to a heart attack while tending to his garden. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah were sifting through his possessions when they discovered a locked drawer in his study. Inside, they found approximately 200 letters from Margaret correspondence he had kept but never revealed to them. Upon reading them, they learned of updates regarding their mother's life in prison, her reflections on her decisions, expressions of remorse, and inquiries about their lives. The narrative of Richard and Margaret Coleman is not a simple account of right and wrong. It is a story concerning the intricate evaluations individuals make when confronted with impossible choices. It illuminates how love and fear can serve as motivations for identical actions, and how the repercussions of those actions can extend through generations in ways that no one could have foreseen. Richard Coleman reported his wife to the FBI because he believed it was his obligation. Subsequently, he misled his children for 6 years because he believed it was his duty. Both of these choices represented simultaneous acts of integrity and acts of betrayal, depending on the perspective from which they are viewed.